Right, hello everybody. I'm Mark Littman, and it's a real pleasure to welcome a small but very special group of people. Online, great to have you here. As you know, UCL-TB does a number of things. We're very much here for the UCL community and everybody who's linked to it. And we're all about TB, mycobacterial diseases, and related stuff like HIV, because we can't ever escape that sort of work. One of the things that we very much like to do is have networking events such as this. And they are about meeting up with each other, having a bit more fun than something in a formal meeting, and also, though, doing a bit of what's been happening in the world. And the union meeting is always a great excuse to do this, both because it contains incredible new data, which I think is very exciting, and perhaps more importantly, because it has so much UCL input. And I think it's vital to both recognise that and also celebrate it as well. Today we've got people who've given their time very much, and I want to say thank you in particular to Ilaria, who, even though she keeps saying I've done nothing, that's the first thing she'll say. She's mouthing what I've done. She's done lots to pull this together. So I'm going to stop now. I think you've got projected our fabulous speakers, and so first I'd like to ask Nicola, welcome. Come and tell us all about the things that you saw and were involved with.
Thank you. So I was tasked with the daunting task of reporting about some of the interesting talks that I went to at the union. So just giving a very quick whistle tour through some of the talks I went to. So one of the talks that I'll be reporting on is the 2R2 post-hoc analysis about treatment adherence. Well, this analysis specifically looking at treatment adherence for the 2R squared trial. It's a multi-center phase 2B trial of high-dose, short-duration IPT versus standard rifampicin for TB preventative treatment. The aim of the trial was, or the aim of this analysis was looking at discontinuation patterns and individual factors in individuals receiving TBT with standard versus high-dose rifampicin. So some of the methods. So this is a follow-on analysis from the main trial analysis, which I've put a big screenshot of at the top there. So the methods for this analysis was they looked at liver pull counts done at 3-month follow-up visits to measure treatment adherence at 2, 4, and 8 weeks high dose, and 4, 8, and 16 weeks standard care arm. So they looked at 1,281 patients and excluded observations if providers discontinued TBT due to adverse events of TB disease. What was really interesting about this specific analysis and about this presentation is they looked at behaviors, certain behaviors related to treatment adherence as being predictive of early discontinuation. And the outcomes they looked at were treatment discontinuation at 3 different time points, so early, mid, and then sort of late discontinuation. And they looked at patients completing treatment not per protocol or completing treatment per protocol. And they defined completing treatment per protocol as being as taking more than 80% of doses in less than 120% treatment duration. And so what they found was that 16% of patients across the study arms discontinued treatment before first follow-up, 5% for second, and 2% after second visit. They specifically looked at whether this was different between the different arms of the studies, and they found no association between individual characteristics and early discontinuation. But they found that more than a quarter of the participants discontinued TBD treatment regimens with rifampicin mainly in the early treatment period, and the discontinuation was associated with some of the behaviors that they looked at, and these included no medication bottle at follow-up, if they missed more than 20% of their doses between appointments, and if they had symptoms of intolerance. That was the 2R squared trial. So another one that I wanted to highlight was I looked at Ultra-Curto, which was a multi-center. This was in the late breaker session, the Union CBC late breaker session. And this was a multi-center randomized open-label phase 4 clinical trial. And they looked at 1 versus 3 months of rifampicin and isoniazid to prevent TB in people who were exposed in household or workplace this result, specifically the population is people who don't have HIV. So the aims of this analysis, what they're reporting currently, was to compare treatment success with good adherence, and to look at safety and tolerability of 1-HB versus 3-HB. So the sample size of 249 patients enrolled in 1-HB and 251 in 3-HB. And so in terms of methods, so they looked at adherence outcomes as if greater than 90% of adherence was documented. They looked at safety endpoints, grade 2 targeted events or stopping study medications because of side effects. They enrolled 500 HIV-uninfected individuals with no active TB but positive TSD or Ibra, plus contact with a confirmed TB case in the last 9 months, and then into these 2 arms of the study. So, interestingly, in their descriptive results, 67% of participants were female. And obviously, given that it's discussion at the union, we don't necessarily get some of the other information, but I think for the future, it would be interesting to learn more about the gender distribution. Looking at 86% of patients were successfully completed the regimen, and then looking at targeted adverse events, grade 2, 15% in 1-HP and 9% in 3-HP. They discontinued treatment due to adverse events, only 7% of patients versus 4%. The grade 3 targeted adverse events was 4% versus 3% during the 2 study. Most common adverse events were hepatotoxicity, nausea, and vomiting. And 1-HP regimen had more targeted safety events than 3-HP, mostly low grade. In the last study that I wanted to report on was one that I was involved in as well. So this is the ASCENT trial. We reported on the equity analysis. It's also related to treatment adherence. This was a 3-arm plus randomized trial, flat interventions versus standard of care in Ethiopia. And this is a follow-on study, pre-specified analysis, following on from the effectiveness results that were reported last year at the Union. The aim of this study was to assess the equity efficiency trade-offs in relation to the implementation of DAS in Ethiopia. And we looked at a sample size of 78 health facilities. We estimated individual level costs and outcomes. Outcomes related to disability adjusted life years for each study arm. And we analysed costs and outcomes for up to 2-year post-enrollment using Bayesian hierarchical models accounting for clustering. We looked at household ECP, and it was assessed based on an asset index, and we looked at the distribution of costs and outcomes between households of different socioeconomic position using illness concentration curves and illness concentration indices. Found no difference in values between study arms, no difference in the primary outcome values by household socioeconomic position. We looked at the number of healthcare facility visits were substantially lower in the data arms, 30 visits per treatment episode versus 10 per treatment episode in the intervention arms, and there was no difference in the composite POA treatment outcomes. Participants in the standard of care arm reported similar travel costs than TAT arms, despite a 3-fold increase in the number of visits. And we found that the reduced patient costs experienced by those with low socioeconomic position in the intervention arms. So concluded that that's were cost saving in the setting, pro-employer but effect neutral. That's where the 3 that I'm going to highlight. Later on.
How do we want to do questions? We can get questions typed in. Oh.
See it coming up. Yes. There.
So maybe should we pause there? Thank you so much, by the way, as I say to everybody presenting. It's really great for this. Maybe I'll start unless there's any questions here. So it's great to see all this focus on adherence, because that's always been the sort of issue, hasn't it? When we say, well, the outcome was this, we don't really know. The difficulty is actually what you're measuring all the time, I think. Because the cut-offs of 80% it's always, I find hard, because I never know if that's really as efficacious as, if that's the best way of measuring things. And I think you used pill counts for certainly the first study, didn't you?
Well, I think they were reporting that they used pill counts. Yes. I think each study had a different.
That's very good.
So I think each study had a different way of looking at adherence. In 2R squared, they were looking at taking adherence as more than 80% of doses in fewer than 120% treatment duration. And I almost think with this study, they were doing mostly pill counts. So a lot of the behavior that they were observing was when people came back, did they have the medication bottle with them so they could do the pill count?
Yeah.
So it looks as if they were predominantly focusing on pill counts here. They had used a different Ultra-Curto. They used a different measure. It was also looking at pill counts predominantly, but they looked at more than 90% adherence. They considered that adherence.
Can I just ask on this one? I might have missed it. You might have said it, but when it says 86% of patients successfully completed regimen, is that across both arms?
It is across both arms.
There was no difference.
Portion.
Okay.
Well, not statistically significant. And
That's the 1 HP dip, so it's and it's percentage of the total expected doses.
I think that is important because they obviously exclude patients who had to stop because of incident. So.
Any other questions?
So they excluded patients who discontinued because of adverse events.
They excluded patients who were stopping because providers had advised them to stop. But they knew that here's their monitoring of patients who themselves decide to stop based on the adverse events. I think that's where I understood.
Excellent. Suzanne, are you there?
So first of all, thanks for asking Anna and myself to give you some highlights. Unfortunately, neither of us were in Bali, but we did have online access, although because of the time differences, it was actually very difficult to attend the majority of the sessions. But I've gone through some of the online material from 2 symposia, one of which is a TPT for kids, so somewhat similar, and another one on diagnostic algorithms. So let me just... Okay, so this symposium was on November 13th, and it was TB preventive treatment for children, where are and what's next. And the first speaker gave a summary of the WHO updates on TPT for children, the recommendations and dosing guidance. And really the 2 things to highlight, which you're probably familiar with, is that the new recommendation for TPT for MDR-TB is 6 months of daily levofloxacin, and that 3 HP isoniazid rifapentine dosing for people of all ages is now recommended, including for children under 2 years of age. And I think some of the things that, for those of us that work in paediatrics, that are really important is that they're now using standardized weight bands across therapeutic areas to simplify administration across multiple comorbidities, for example, malaria and HIV. They've got a joint age and weight band approach for children under 10 kilos. And the important thing is that 3HP can now be used for adults and children at all ages. And the drugs are provided in that separate. Unfortunately, there's no fixed dose combination for individuals under 50 kilos, but there is a double pack that's provided containing both drugs in foil wrapped packages. And for those over 50 kilos, you can use rifapentine isoniazid 300-300 fixed dose combination tab. And for kids, if the child-friendly formulation, whatever that means, is not available, then an adult 300 milligram rifapentine tablet can be crushed. And the rifapentine crush study that's recently completed has shown that there is a good bioavailability using that. So to summarize, the main take-home message of the WHO is that 3HP can now be used as TPT for adults and children of all ages, and that a child-friendly formulation of rifapentine is available. Now, one of the main things that was pointed out is that child-friendly often to us means dispersible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's palatable or easily taken by the child. So a lot of these studies are looking at acceptability and palatability. So there were a couple of individual talks in this session that I've briefly summarised. One is from Makita, Gombe and Harari, who looked at a number of large studies that have been ongoing and gave an overview of those. Basically, these were studies generating evidence for using 3HP across different populations and service development methods. So the Dolphin study has generated study for co-administration of 3HP with dolutegravir without adjusting the dose of DTG. Dolphin 2 is investigating 3HP initiation in ART naive people living with HIV. TBTC study 35 will inform dosing of 3HP in children under 2 years of age, and so on. This will further be expanded to all populations in 5 additional studies. Dolphin Kids, which is currently evaluating 3HP with dolutegravir, and Dolphin Moms, which is looking at 3HP and 1HP in pregnant women. 1 to 3, comparing 1 HP to 3HP in people living with HIV and household contacts. The CRUSH study, which is completed, which looked at the bioavailability and effectiveness of acceptability of rifapentine in children, and a paediatric formulation study. And the lessons learned so far from this paediatric TPT rollout is that actually 3HP use is very limited, and children living with HIV in particular are mostly still on 6 months of isoniazid. The other problem that was highlighted was that really overburdened health systems just can't cope. Most clinics, or many clinics, don't even have scales to weigh children, so they're guesstimating the size of the child and therefore the dose of drug to give them. And because many clinics were understaffed, they were sort of motivated to screen and treat for TB infection in household contacts. And there's still reported medication challenges. So bitter taste of the CRUSH tablets, the need to take with food, which adds expense to many households. And for many parents, the pill burden was just perceived to be too high, and when they're having to mix drugs with yogurt or bananas, that takes a lot of time. And parents often perceived that their children were getting even more drugs than they were for treating TB. So those are big issues in trying to roll this out for a paediatric population. So really, better implementation support is definitely needed out in the field. Then I think certainly in the shore trial in which I've been working, we're using dispersible formulations, fortunately not dispersible levofloxacin, but this presentation was on the acceptability of dispersible and non-dispersible levofloxacin formulations in children. And this was data from 2 trials that are completed. One is TB Champ, which I think most of you all know was an open-label PK lead-in study for MDR-TB childhood contacts, and it included a quantitative and qualitative acceptability study. And just worth noting that at the time of the trial, the standard of care for TPT of MDR-TB in childhood contacts was non-dispersible levofloxacin, ethambutol, and high-dose isoniazid. And then the other study that gathered acceptability data was the PERFORM study, which was an open-label randomized 2x2 crossover study looking at the bioavailability and acceptability of dispersible versus crushed formulations. And they looked at acceptability and in particular palatability and ease of use being a priority for drug use in children. And I think just to give you some quick take-home messages, TB CHAMP open label study showed that 93% of children drank their dispersible tablets that had been dissolved in water. And that was highlighted as a huge improvement for families, and that it's in the past, most parents would have perhaps been crushing tablets and disguising the taste in yogurt, perhaps with some added honey, amongst other things. So, as I'd already stated, that adds a lot of extra hassle and expense to families. And over 80% of caregivers said that it was much easier to use a dispersible levofloxacin tablet. Palatability in this setting was that the levofloxacin formulation smelled sweet and tasted good. It was mint versus fruit, but it was also highlighted by speakers afterwards that acceptability of flavours is very culturally dependent. So what might work in one setting won't necessarily work in another, and we really need to take these into consideration. And then in the TB Perform study, they, as I'd said, they had a subcomponent which was comparing the acceptability of dispersible versus crushed non-dispersible levofloxacin. And just worth noting that caregivers reported that taste, vomiting, child refusal still a problem, particularly in the crushed tablets, but they like the dispersible levofloxacin, easier to prepare, and they said that their children liked it. So overall, caregivers prefer dispersible formulations, but they highlighted the fact that the context in which the caregivers are giving the medicine and their wider experience of having to take TB meds had a huge impact on the care given to the child. And then there was a final presentation in this symposium on upcoming trials in TB prevention for children. One is 3HP in children living with HIV. That's the Dolphin Kids study, which is evaluating 3HP with twice daily dolutegravir. Enrollment is due to close in December 2024, and they hope to report by mid-2025. There's the Impact 2024 study, which is looking at PK and safety of 1HP in children. And there have been a number of delays in starting this study, but they're absolutely sure they're going to commence in the second quarter of 2025 with results in 2028. And that again is looking at dispersible standalone formulations for rifapentine and isoniazid with a dolutegravir-based ART regimen. And then there's the Asteroid study, which I believe is being led by Kelly Dooley. And this is a study which is incorporating both adults and children. And it's two arms comparing 6 weeks of daily rifapentine for 6 weeks versus the standard of care control arm, which is 12 to 16 weeks of rifamycin-based TPT, so 3HP or 3HR or 4R. And they're following participants up for 24 months, and there's a sample size of 1,120 for safety and 3,400 for effectiveness. And one of the highlights, one thing that was highlighted was that Kelly Dooley's been in receipt of an NIH Merit Award, which will enable her to look at special populations, including children. And the plan is that once they've got initial PK and early safety data and a DSMB review, they will then go on to include children in this trial. So children will no longer be an afterthought, as has often been the case, and they're being included in earlier studies. So that's a great thing. And then finally, there's Breach TB, which is 1 month of bedaquiline for PanTB prevention, and that's a phase 3 efficacy trial. and they plan to enrol high-risk children from study initiation. And there'll be built-in acceptability assessments, and they hope that long-term this will be a bridge to the development and evaluation of a long-acting injectable formulation. I think I will just move on because of time. So the second symposium I reviewed was a maternal child TB symposium, which was looking at a validation of treatment decision algorithms for the diagnosis of pulmonary TB in children. And for those of you amongst us that are paediatricians, this is diagnosing TB in most children is extremely difficult. And for decades now, we've been trying to use diagnostic algorithms with variable success. And in 2022, the WHO issued an interim recommendation on integrated treatment decision algorithms, or TDAs. And the idea is that they will build confidence amongst healthcare workers at primary healthcare level to make decisions on initiating treatment. And there's a TDA for child package of generic research tools. And according to one of our colleagues, Julie Hyun, who was present, she said evaluation of these diagnostic algorithms was a big hot topic at the union meeting. So the WHO just highlighted that 44% of children under 15 years of age who were exposed to TB are not getting TB treatment. In addition to their TB diagnostic algorithms that were published in 2022, they issued a rapid communication in September 24 recommending that parallel testing of a respiratory specimen and a stool should also be carried out as part of the algorithm package. So there are a number of TDA studies ongoing, and they expect the cohort size will be about 20,000 by the time they come to analyse all the data. So one presentation within the symposium was looking at the evaluation of using the WHO treatment decision algorithm in children with presumptive TB in Nigeria. This was a multi-centre, single-arm diagnostic evaluation study. The study population was children under 10 years of age with presumptive TB. They had a sample size of 1,038, and half of those were in primary healthcare centres. And the enrolment was between November 2023 and April 24, and their control was children under 10 years of age who'd been diagnosed with TB in the 6-month period from November 2022 to April 23. For those of you that aren't familiar with the algorithm, one of the key elements of the algorithm is that you identify high-risk children who are at high risk of rapid TB progression, i.e. HIV infected, under 2 years of age or malnourished. And if they're high risk, you investigate for TB and score immediately. If they're not at high risk, you treat for a non-TB condition and then you review them 1 to 2 weeks later. You do TB investigations where available, gene expert, TB lam on urine and the chest x-ray. A history of a TB contact in the last 12 months is also a significant factor. And then you score the patient based on the signs and symptoms, and then whether there is a chest x-ray that you can also score or not. And algorithm A is for patients in a setting where there is a chest x-ray. Algorithm B is for those where there is no chest x-ray available. And preliminary results of the TB treatment decision was that 72% had a gene expert or a LAMP result, positive result. 51% had a chest x-ray, with 47% being reported as showing signs compatible with TB, and just 8%, which is perhaps not surprising, had a history of household TB contact. And we know that parents or caregivers are very reluctant to disclose if there is a TB contact in the household. And they were able to make a decision to treat for TB based on the TDAs in 33%. and there was no significant difference between primary and secondary tertiary facilities. And I think really just to highlight that they found that both algorithm A with the chest X-ray and algorithm B without chest X-ray had a specificity of 99.7% and a sensitivity of around 93% in the first overall analysis. This isn't published data yet. And it had a large impact on TB notifications. So apparently the number of TB notifications changed from 113 childhood TB cases notified on average over the 6-month control period versus 405 under 10s in the study period. Then Médecins Sans Frontières also presented data on the use of diagnostic TB algorithms in children, and they presented interim results from a study that they've completed in 5 children. Again, children presenting with symptoms of TB under 10 years of age. And their study sites were Guinea, where they're mostly or all children living with HIV, Niger, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Uganda. And they also included feasibility and acceptability studies. They just highlighted that following the algorithm cascade, the primary reasons to start TB treatment in this cohort of children was either a positive gene expert, just 6.7%, a positive urine TB LAM, 5.6%, a history of a TB contact, 18.6%, or an algorithm score of greater than 10, which is the cutoff for starting treatment. And they highlighted that most of the children with positive expert results, 76%, or positive TB LAM, 63%, also had an algorithm symptom score of greater than 10, so a good predictive result. In terms of children that were commenced on treatment, 26.7% overall were commenced on treatment, 28.6% in the high risk group and 13.6% in the lower risk group. And the majority of children were started on treatment within the first week of assessment. And they just said that really the primary reason to start TB treatment in analysing the results was an algorithm score of greater than 10. And they highlighted the fact that among children living with HIV started on TB treatment, 7% had a positive TB LAM. So the diagnostic accuracy of the new algorithms, they reported high sensitivity and good specificity. They noted that a high proportion of children were initiated on TB treatment following the introduction of the algorithm, and the red line in this bottom bar chart shows the number of cases started on TB treatment before algorithm implementation to the left of the vertical bar and to the right after. And it was feasibility and acceptability. It definitely speeded up treatment process, increases TB diagnosis, etc. But there were a lot of challenges, and that staff at clinics felt it increased their workload, consultations took longer, etc. And it took a lot of high quality communication with caregivers. So in conclusion, diagnostic accuracy of the new WHO algorithm was high. It led to a high proportion of children being started in TB treatment. Scores were thought to be useful. And really, they highlighted that a history of a TB contact was key, although certainly my experience and our experience ensures that that's actually pretty low reporting, and that TB LAM is a useful tool in children living with HIV. And that's it. Thanks very much.
Suzanne, thank you so much. That was extremely comprehensive and fascinating in terms of the sort of cascade of care, where there's a difference between people being started on treatment and actually completing it, which seemed to be an issue maybe with the preventive therapy. I'm just checking, are there questions? Di, thank you so much for what you've put in the text. That's in the chat. That's very helpful. It's a description of TB CHAMP.
Oh, thanks, Di.
That's okay. Actually, I think Trin's on on the call, so she might want to add to that or contradict me. Can I ask a quick question, Mark?
Please, yes, definitely.
Yeah, Suzanne, was there anything about implementation of the SHINE results, 4-month treatment? I mean, I guess that, I just remember the last paediatric meeting, which I don't think you did review. I mean, I understood that happened, and obviously a lot of the pediatrics would have been at that separate WHO pediatric meeting.
Yeah.
But at the last one of those, there was a lot of discussion, including, descriptions of how they were implementing 4 months for the non-severe TB in places like Kenya and Zambia. And we know that that's also been happening in Spain and the UK. So I just wondered how much that was being rolled out, and whether these algorithms were helping also in differentiating between severe and non-severe TB in children. Or
Actually,
did you not?
No, that's a good question. And there was one, I mean, I was obviously just going through the recordings of the talks, and there were a lot of sessions, and I just saw one mention at the end of one of in this TB treatment algorithm section on incorporating SHINE into shorter course treatment with children with mild disease. I can go back at some point to that session and just see.
Yeah. I mean, it may be that Anna's got some more on that as well.
Yeah.
Thanks, Suzanne. Really a very nice presentation. Unfortunately, I can't add anything on SHINE implementation. I think luckily we have still account and access, so we can go through more pediatric sessions in time.
Yeah.
And it's very nice to see so much pediatric data, and also the approach is so refreshing, where you're talking about palatability.
Yeah.
And just take the medicines. It's like, how can we make life easier? Which is something, we completely ignore most of the time in adult medicine.
Well, having worked in the family clinic at Northwick Park and elsewhere, you recognise what a challenge it is for parents, giving their children the TB drugs, and certainly in the context of the SURE TBM trial that I'm working on with Di and Anna and colleagues. Pill burden and palatability is a huge issue, and we are doing some evaluation of that within the study. So hopefully we'll be able to add additional data to acceptability and palatability. And I can see Anna's got her hand up.
Suzanne, just clarification really, maybe we need to go back. In my understanding, 3-HP tablets that are used for adults can be used, the same tablets from 2 years of age, so certainly less than 50 kilos, and they can be crushed. And those are tablets that have been used in Uganda, for example, in national programs. So I'm slightly kind of confused why the guidelines say it's more than 50 kilos. I think in adults you administer 3 tablets, and in a child of from 2 years, or whatever weight band is corresponding to 2 years, it's just a 1 tablet. So I think just probably we need to go back to these recommendations and make sure that we understand. Certainly not what's happening in the programs really.
Well, this is what was reported by the WHO. I can't remember who it was now. The summary of the WHO, and they definitely said that rifampicin crush studies only just come out, which shows that the bioavailability is the same. But we can review that session, which is this one here. It's SPO5. And it's the WHO update. So it was Tiziana Massini.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue about bioavailability is quite important, because my understanding is that Levo, and one of the reasons why TB Champ did not use the dispersible levofloxacin was that the bioavailability, it wasn't bioavailable between dispersible and non-dispersible, and that is something that we were very familiar with. I mean, for example, same with a number of different HIV drugs. But on the other hand, I think it's also true that, you know, having the dispersible fixed dose combination baby tablets now much more available, they are dispersible and they seem to be quite well accepted, don't they?
It's always sobering to see talk of rifapentine when we work in the NHS, which can't get it. In fact, Europe, as you know, can't get rifapentine, which is a problem that we're trying to change, isn't it, Jeff? Next month, I'm sure. Yeah. Great. Any more questions? Sorry. No? Yes?
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you again. And our next speaker is Ilaria, who's going to talk about some highlights and I think focus on End-TBQ.
Yeah. Can you? Yeah. So in the next, let's say, 10, 15 minutes, it's not democratic. So I'm going to show what the studies I like and to present today. So, sorry. It's going to be three. One is on drug-resistant TB and TB results, and the other two are PanTB interview results and bedaquiline, delamanid, and phosphodiesterase study. So let's start with the first one. End-TBQ trial is a phase 3 non-inferior clinical trial sponsored by MSF and IPH, and looked at treatment for free XDR pulmonary TB in adults. So participants had resistance also to fluoroquinolone on top of rifamycin. And the interventional arm was treatment of 6 to 9 months with bedaquiline, clofazimine, delamanid, and linezolid. Linezolid was given for the first 4 months, 600 milligrams daily, and after was randomized to be received at 300 milligrams daily or 600 milligrams 3 times a week. And versus the standard of care. I said 6 to 9 months because this was based at the baseline risk factor, and this risk factor was the smear and the cavity. So basically, at the baseline, the participants were categorized as limited or extensive and given 6 for the limited disease, 9 months for the extensive disease. The participants that were categorized at the baseline as limited, but then had a delayed response, the investigator could choose to extend to 9 months of treatment, while the extensive was 9 months and there was no possibility to extend further. Is the investigation. The study was implemented in this country. As you can see from the percentage, most participants came from India and Pakistan. Most of the sites were the same sites as for End-TB trial, the other study that was presented last year. 324 participants were randomized, and here below you see the other analysis population for the safety, MITT, and the protocol. So the next one is going to be on the MITT, so on 247 participants, the baseline characteristic, just a couple of notes here. Female percent, 46%. HIV was really low, 1.6%. In terms of cavitation, more than half had cavitation at the chest X-ray baseline, and the smear, I would say around 70% were severe positive, but half were 1 or 2 plus. Another interesting thing to look at is the control arm. How was the regimen? Was the standard of care at the different sites? More than around 90% receive the same drug that were in the investigational arm, plus 1 drug more. So like instead of 4 drug regimen, 5 drug regimen, and the fifth was usually the cycloserine. And this was given for a mean of 77 weeks. So let's go to the results. At week 73 in MITT population, what we can see here, we see that the control performed really well. So favorable outcome in 89% versus 86% in the experimental arm. If we look at the unfavorable breakdown numbers, we see that full treatment response was 4.3 in the experimental versus 3.6, and recurrence there were 8, so almost 5% in the investigational arm versus 0 in the control. So if we look graphically with the forest plot, the upper part is on MITT population 73 week, and that is the primary objective. You can see that in the MITT population, the point estimates is around 0 with a range between minus 9.1 and 9.5. The non-inferiority margin was minus 12%. So in the MITT population, they met the non-inferiority, but not in the per-protocol population. You can see that across the non-inferiority margin. And because in the statistical analysis plan was said that in the both population they should have showed the non-inferiority, with that they could not conclude that the study met the non-inferiority. The lower part of the slide is subgroup analysis, looking at the extent of the disease in MITT population, and this is the reason why you don't see the bar at minus 12, because it was a subgroup population. But here we can see that in the limited disease, the difference between limited and extensive disease in terms of the result, the risk difference compared to the control arm. And so you can see in the limited is, let's say, much better in the investigational arm compared to the extensive disease. In terms of safety, not much to say. The only thing I want to point out that in control, there were many more permanent discontinuation of at least 1 drug compared to the experimental. The protocol allowed in the investigational arm at least, maximum 1 drug, permanent drug discontinuation in the experimental. In the control were 2. To conclude this End-TBQ, they concluded say that could be a good option for participants with limited disease. The other point they make is that with extensive disease, to prevent relapse, the conventional regimen may be required, or longer regimen is needed. And the other bit is the relevant about this study was just on fluoroquinolone resistant. That is the first one that only was investigated in this population, and also highlight the importance of the fluoroquinolone in the drug-resistant TB treatment. So I will move to the next one, and then we do the question at the end. The next one is about PanTB. PanTB, for those that don't know, is a big consortium, let's say US-based, more or less a cousin of the European-based Untitled TB, where a multiple collaboration from academic partner and pharmaceutical companies, and their aim is to find a regimen regardless rifampicin sensitivity to be shorter, 3 or less months, with a good safety profile and efficacy. So this study looked the plan was to have 2 stages. The first one, regimen selection, and the second one, duration of the regimen. The first stage was looking in drug-sensitive pulmonary TB in adults. 16 weeks, 4 months of treatment of delamine, bedaquiline, probodepistat, and sulfetolide for 4 months, or pretomine, bedaquiline, probodepistat, and sulfetolide versus the standard of care. And in principle, starting with drug-sensitive TB, the idea was then to move to stage 2 with the arm that was more promising.
I think I'm moving so.
Good singing.
Sorry. And I'm using all these conditional because you're going to see that this study has been early stop. So these were the results presented as interim analysis after the interim analysis of the stage 1. The study started in June 2023 and they stopped enrollment in July 2024 with less than 100 participants randomized, and 57 completed the study treatment of 16 weeks. So the baseline characteristic across the patient randomized are here presented, and we can say that it was pretty extensive disease with cavitation present in the majority of the participants, and smear more than 2 in more than 50%, few HIV included, and 30% had a previous episode. So what they look at, here you see the sputum culture conversion at month 2 and month 3. You can see a month 2 compared to the standard of care are a bit lower. Both the lamanide-based regimen and pretomine is 30%, and month 3, half of the participants had a culture conversion and is similar to the control arm. But because their aim, as I said at the beginning, was to look at to investigate a regimen that could potentially be 3 or less months, for them this was not enough. Looking at end of treatment, so like week 16 for the investigational arms and week 24 for the control arm. Actually, you see here that 50% of the lamanide allocated participants did not have a sustained culture conversion, 28% only in the pretomine one, and 36% in the control arm. From safety perspective, no major finding to highlight. So for the conclusion, first, this went through the IDMC. The IDMC recommended to stop the regimen, and they decided to take the recommendation by the IDMC. For them, it's a great result that with less than 100 participants, they were able to stop the trial, use the resources in another way. They are now planning what to do because they have the site open. So maybe by end of 2025, they are going to be able to have new regimen, or so they are still like studying what to do now. But their idea was to really have these results available, and for them these results are month 2 and month 3 did not support the continuation of the study. We can go through more, but just because you can at this time, I think I will fast to the next one. I'm presenting this just because you just see the results of month 2 and month 3 for that. And I wanted we look together at this because for me are so different, and I would say how is possible. So this is a study presented by Otsuka on the last day of the conference, and on bedaquiline, delamine, and pabodepistat, so 3 drug regimen in drug-sensitive pulmonary TB in adults. A bit of rationale. Pabodepistat is a new class drug that is a DPR1 inhibitor. Here you see from the phase 2A the decrease of the colony with the combination. So the DBQ, delamine, bedaquiline, and pabodepistat is the black one that is similar to the standard care. So for that, this is good to have a backbone regimen to study further. So they implemented this study, a phase 2B to C, that is looking both at the dosing of pabodepistat in 3 different doses, 10, 30, and 90 milligrams, together with bedaquiline and delamine versus the standard care for 4 months. The primary endpoint here was the safety of the participant achieving the sustained culture conversion at the end of treatment period. So, baseline characteristic, I would say that cavitation was present in 73% of the population, and also more than half had at least 2 plus at smear, and no HIV in this population. So what they found, you see in the upper part the investigational arms, and they put together the one with delamine and pabodepistat. This was at the end of treatment. So at week 16, 96% of the participants reached the sustained culture conversion, and 100% in the control arm. And there were no big difference between the participant with bilateral cavitation or not. So basically a difference of 4% compared to the control arm. So the non-inferiority margin was minus 12%, so they met the non-inferiority for the pabodepistat arm, only 3 drug regimen. And they also here presented at month 2, and at month 2 the arms with pabodepistat were around 50%. That is very similar to the control arm. And if you just remember what we saw before, also a month 2 was less, both in the control arm in that other group, but we were around 20 and 30%. Here we have a 50% at week 8, and here you see like 96% a week. So I was just wanted to point out that I found very difficult. Of course, a different study we cannot compare, but just to see, and these were just 3 drugs. What they look also as secondary outcome, the favorable outcomes at 12 months post-randomization and the relapse. And they see that in the shorter regimen, the 4 months regimen, the relapse were 12 in the pabodepistat arm versus the 1 in the control arm. And for safety, again, not much to say. They look also specifically to hepatic and cardiac safety, and there was no warning signs. So their conclusion is that the 3 drug combination with delamine, bedaquiline, and pabodepistat show a good effect at 4 months, and they will say that may be improved with a 4th drug. So that is.
Thank you. Questions?
Yes,
you need to shout into the microphone.
we've got enough evidence from the End-TBQ and PanTB and everything to say that protominin's better than delaminine.
You read my mind because I really.
There's sort of like some hints of that, but then nothing's really being compared directly to each other. And
exactly.
People seem to be talking about this, but I don't know whether it's just that these things have not been controlled that well between studies. And it seems like a sort of rumor that's getting out there that protominin's a big one.
I don't know. In the PanTB, I was a bit surprised of this, that you see that in the. So here it seems pretty similar, the protominid versus the delaminid, but here at 12 months of treatment there are much less not sustained culture conversion in the protominid arm than in the delaminid one. I agree with you. Maybe we are gonna go in that direction and just do you remember the Simplicity where protominid and pyrazinamide together as like hepatotoxicity? So maybe delaminid would be good if you have to use that drug. I don't know if it's gonna be in United for TB. The study I'm working is Paradigm for TB. We have arms with the same, just the different in protominid and delaminid. Of course, are not powered to look at the difference amongst arms. That's versus the control arm. But there's gonna be more data coming from other studies. I think there are other just Paradigm for TB. Yeah, I tend to agree with you.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be one of the things. Oh yeah, Suzanne, I think your hand is up.
Thanks. I have a question and a comment. So the question is, it's the PanTB trial, which was one of the few presentations I did manage to see in real time. And I wondered whether you felt the open label design meant that there was bias for treatment reinitiation for those patients in the investigational arm.
I don't know. I think the protocol is pretty similar to the Paradigm one, and the criteria are quite strict to restart. So they should have full culture positive 4 weeks apart, and or one culture and some clinical radiological. So I don't know if is the case if they're investigating. I don't know. But since there were here the number of reinitiation, extension, post-treatment, let me see, is something in the notes. No, but yeah, I think my experience in this kind of study are open label and but still I don't know. No, I don't think it's going to be really influenced.
The other... Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry, go on. I'll wait. I'll follow on with my comment.
Please.
Well, the comment was actually one of the things that really struck me about this trial was the impact that discontinuing the trial early had on patients and on the people running the trial. They said it was really difficult for patients when the trial stopped early because within the trial, the patients were having a huge amount of close contact and support provided by the trial team, and then that stopped. And they felt that that's something that really has to be discussed in the early on before you start your trial with community engagement panels, that they accept that this might happen and prepared for it, and likewise that the trial team on the ground also understand that.
Yeah, very true. Di.
Well, it's just a comment. Obviously, I mean, it's an early phase trial, but I mean, you've got fairly hard endpoints of culture conversion. I don't see why you would get bias because of.
Yeah.
I mean, I really don't think that, and also, I mean, I don't think you can think about these not being open label, because if you tried to blind all this, people will be taking an awful lot of placebos and that kind of, and that interferes with your adherence. So there are negative sides of of having it, of trying to blind. So I think with these kind of regimens, there's no way you could do that. And what you try to do is to have independent endpoints, which is what you've got here. But this is early phase anyway. So you have to also think about whether, how much these translate, these intermediate endpoints translate when you get to endpoints in a phase 3 trial. And we saw that in the MOXIE trials, didn't we, that they didn't necessarily translate.
And interesting you should mention quinolones, because I think that was the other message I take from this, is that they seem central to any shorter effective regimen. And these all have chosen, for various reasons, to not include a quinolone. And it's one of the big concerns that we now have with the B-PAL-M regimen routinely, in that the M, the moxifloxacin or the levofloxacin, is being dropped in situations where you've got quinolone resistance, which is already, well, we predictably is causing a problem. So I think, I think we are getting, as Camus was saying, we're getting information in a way which is vital. I mean, it's great there's this many studies. It does feel like there needs to be almost a statement based on this, saying, think carefully about some of the studies that you're doing. Also, again, reflecting what Suzanne was saying, it is fascinating, isn't it? People will run a study. I was amazed when it just stopped. I mean, it's a huge undertaking for everybody when suddenly it all falls away.
They just shut it down very quickly. Is that the?
Yeah.
They move
they don't know.
Yeah.
Follow people.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think also we need to put also everything together. So we had last year the truncate. So it's a strategy. So maybe also what we are showing here is that, maybe we're not going to have a 3 months regimen, or we have, but then we know that some will relapse and maybe it's going to be the same for. Sure. So I don't know, but probably it's not the aim to have a 3 months regimen for everybody. Maybe it's not.
No, and that seems more personal almost, doesn't it? Okay. Excellent.
And it's the same like in NTBQ that you see the limited disease 6 months was enough, and then so it's like.
Someone from TB Alliance at the uni was saying to me, they reckon that is like B-PAL is just as good as B-PAL-M anyway. But I mean, I guess there seems this sort of data out there suggesting that maybe the fluoroquinolone is quite important, but maybe that just wasn't kind of brought out.
Yeah. Well, TB pressure was not really the same B-PAL versus B-PAL-M, so study to bring to so.
We can talk more. I'm aware that we have 2 more speakers, one of which has already started. Camus.
So thanks. I just I was going to talk about diagnostics research. I mean, there was quite a lot of different sessions on diagnostics. It came, quite a few sort of different aura. I tried to just pick out a few things that kind of interested me. It's only like a couple of slides, just of things that seemed interesting. So my first slide was just a couple of points around sort of different modalities that are used for sampling, sort of detect TB disease, really. There's a couple of, I think this stuff sort of often comes up, and I'm never sure, like, which bits of this, if any of it's going to go anywhere. Some people might talk about tongue swabs as a particularly different modality. I think there's one group in the US that seems to sort of consistently produce some tongue swab data. It sounded like it was something of an ongoing sort of study and project for them. I think that essentially tongue swabs, after going through a sort of iterative period of optimization, swabbing different parts of the tongue, using different types of swab, trying to elucidate different types of liquid, they were reaching, not disrespectable kind of comparator to sputum sampling. We've got here 100% sensitivity for tongue swab compared to similar sampling from sputum samples. I think they've kind of accepted they're never going to reach the levels of sensitivity that you would get with a sputum sample, but that for some people, perhaps in children, it may be tolerable. But I think it's very important to swab the back of the tongue. Apparently, there was another session that actually looked at the tolerability of tongue swabbing and actually suggested there was some data saying that actually people really like being tongue swabbed either. So I guess that's also going to provide a challenge. But I think it probably is going to, it may well be part of one of the options that we could use to diagnose TB. For this reason, not to get us into this. There was one presentation from an Indonesian group where they're using this eNose device that is essentially a sort of gas chromatography device that's been around for some time, and they're using that to identify TB. Again, I think they've had some data suggesting that it has kind of moderate sensitivity. I'm trying to think, I think they had numbers here that reason, so sensitivity of again 85% or so. This is using some breath samples from patients, with TB, and then looking at particles in breath too, to try and compare that to some expert. It's used as a diagnostic tool. Again, I think they'd also done a similar project with COVID, and it demonstrated again reasonably good sensitivity for identifying COVID. Again, not quite sure where that's going to go. There would work on face masks in pediatric TB. I thought that was an interesting presentation because actually they successfully identified 0 out of 30 expert positive cases using face masks in pediatric TB. So it's nice, I think, at least refreshing to see some negative data and acceptance that, useful to see that technique work. I think that group's going to continue trying to optimize that. I think again, blood lab can be an option in patients who have HIV disease or greater disseminated. It could be as a diagnostic tool. And again, particularly in children, there's certain amount of work on stool samples and using expert on stool. I think a number of different presentations on it. I think probably trying to sum them together, overall feeling that essentially expert on stool does work. It was interesting being at our British Society conference last week, and we were hearing about the fact that many places in the UK certainly won't do expert on stool samples. It's validated, and I think it's used in a widespread number of settings. I think comparing it to gastric lavage was the feeling that it's not going to hit the sensitivity of that, but is perhaps not the most pleasant sampling strategy. It's certainly less invasive than doing gastric lavage. So again, I think it's going to maintain or continue to be an important part of the toolkit for diagnosing TB in children. It's also worked in people living with HIV, particularly those with low CD4 counts. Again, perhaps in a similar way to LAM being used, although it wasn't as sensitive as LAM. Just had a couple of points on using different modalities to try and enhance detection of TB in samples. And so there's one project looking at using CRISPR as a way of detecting, to speed up detection of TB DNA in sputum samples. Combining a CRISPR system along with fluorescent labeling, that you can get fluorescent filter that can be detected in a reasonably portable system to help identify TB DNA in sputum samples. Again, this is still sort of an early phase, but it's relatively sensitive, I guess, in the way that an expert might be sensitive, but perhaps could be combined in a system. There's another group that applied a similar approach using CRISPR to identify TB DNA in blood samples. And again, they had a small number of patients, but had actually reasonable concordance with concurrent sputum and chest X-ray analysis, which suggests that actually there is things. Thinking about other work in other settings, presenting cell-free DNA to diagnose TB from blood samples, and but probably there is more TB DNA in blood in patients with TB than we appreciate. That as techniques become more sensitive to identifying fragments of DNA, that this may become an alternative sampling strategy. And finally, there's again some work on the implementation of accountable TB, so AI chest X-ray analysis for screening for TB. And again, I think in high-growth settings, it can be reasonably sensitive, although not particularly specific to which goes with previous volumes where that technique is likely to be most useful. Those are my kind of two just overview slides of detecting TB in samples. Again, I think just one or two slides on detecting resistance, drug resistance in TBs. This is the next level. I think that big push from WHO recently to use targeted next generation sequences molecular diagnostic that will at least give us some reasonably well validated analyses. We talk here is like to an extent good for loans and kind of emerging data right now might fit for bedaquiline and for other new drugs. It's certainly being used operationally in a number of settings. There's a report from the ASCENT program because they've got a high proportion of vaccine resistance can be driven by mutations outside of the classical vaccine resistance determining regions, at least by expert. They've really pushed forward on using targeted next generation sequencing because it targets a larger part of the RPOB gene and sort of catch these sort of missed mutations. So there was some description of their program and how they are using, I think, their expert NextDR to screen for isoniazid resistance, and then anyone who's got isoniazid resistance then goes on to target next generation sequencing and how they implemented that. I think there's the usual problems with implementing any of these things that targets next generation sequencing, while some of it can be done in a district health setting, still requires DNA protein sequencing. And so there's the usual complications of trying to transport samples to the central laboratory and operate who maintains adequate supplies to run a sequencing service and so to do that. Targeted next generation sequencing is becoming quite often used directly on sputum samples, so you can go directly from sputum sample to sort of genetic resistance profile. I think like any of these techniques, the sensitivity drops off, and particularly lower samples are going to have lower DNA concentrations in them. So the experts, any positive readings seem to be a fairly good predictor. At least a moderate amount of DNA in the expert sample, that you're going to have high chance of getting a good genetic resistance profile using TNGS kind of trace or low DNA concentrations. It can work, but it becomes a lot less reliable. There was some discussion from Nazir Ismail, who did run the WHO program that implemented the TNGS networks in South Africa again. I think that sensitivity that bedaquiline measures possibly validated is suboptimal, probably depending on the drug. Sensitivity is around 50-60% to identify resistance to those drugs. Again, there's a certain amount of talk about how that could be implemented in a pragmatic way. I think that a lot of the algorithms that they drew up seem to rely on saying, do you think the person's going to have resistance to one of these drugs? If they're high risk, then you can do the test, but they're going to have it. If they're low risk, then you can do the test, but I don't know how useful that's really going to be until we can drive sensitivity higher. I mean, I think that ideally, it needs to be used as a screening tool where if you needed to do further testing, we don't need it testing or something you can just put that in the pathway after you've done this as an initial test, but I don't know if we're quite there yet. There was a little bit of discussion around, so most of the TNGS stuff has been using the Dplex kit, which is made by the industry company, and then it's partnered with the loop to sell that to countries. There's a little talk about Ample TB, which is the nanopore equivalent. I think it sounds like Ample, the nanopore system, actually probably going to be pretty similar or just as good. I think that the WHO wanted a kind of packaged solution, so that was the way they analysed it. I think the nanopore team basically just got as good a catalogue set up on the bioinformatics side, or the actual technical side in terms of quality it's generated was pretty reliable. So I think that Ample could probably catch on reasonably quickly some bioinformatic optimization. There was talk about using bacteriophage as a diagnostic well, both as a diagnostic but also to provide a kind of rapid sensitivity profile. I think essentially to grow is essentially to enhance EPTB testing because mycobacteriophage with a fluorescent reporter again can give you very early readout within a couple of days as to whether a bacteria are growing in the presence of drug. So you can do your phenotypic testing with your drug, but you can get fluorescent report within 2 to 3 days instead of you waiting 7 to 14 to 21 days to get a sort of classical drug susceptibility testing. I think that's developing that. I think feels slightly perhaps left out by the find of WHO push that's very much focused on genetic diagnostics. There was David Alland, who sort of developed Expert in combination with Kevin, presented data on their new Expert cartridge that's going to be essentially it's a more refined DNA extraction tool. So I think the problem they recognised is they've made the Expert XDR, which gives you resistance profiles to a bunch of drugs that have been used for drug resistance anymore, and particularly how we're going to facilitate diagnostics for all of these exciting new regimens that we've heard of, new drugs that we used before but also can't really detect resistance to very easily. The Expert cartridge is going to be a DNA extraction tool. So incorporate some of the elements that you get with the targeted next generation sequencing platforms where you'll get a multiplex PCR with drug resistance genes, and then you'll have to take the output of the Expert cartridge and then you can get your genetic drug resistance profile. I think that's kind of the solution that Kevin have gone for, given that the molecular targets of these new drugs are becoming so large that they're beyond the capabilities of the probe-based technologies that have been used for, the Expert Ultra, Expert XDR. There was a bit of talk about whole genome sequencing, which we've kind of gone for in the UK, but hasn't really been used that widespread amongst different countries. Our UK whole genome sequencing is kind of classic short read sequencing with Luna. One job from UCL was data from his group working through about implementing nanopore sequencing. And I think for me it was interesting just to see how they've gone through kind of an iterative process of trying to optimize it to make it cost effective and fast. And I think it was just interesting to see that they've got cost down to $50 for a nanopore genome sequencing for coverage through a number of different optimization steps. And then my last slide was just about resistance to new drugs, particularly when you very pissed amongst patients who've got NTB as a baseline population. I think we always get a number of these reports. I picked out kind of 2 here that were, I guess, indicative of different settings. I think bedaquiline resistance, the South African program being first to implement bedaquiline, and also kind of being leaders in reporting bedaquiline resistance and kind of varying degrees of bedaquiline resistance around the country. We've got their phenotypic bedaquiline susceptibility testing program running now. So generating more and more of this data, I think they've come up with 6.5% is their kind of average baseline rate of bedaquiline resistance amongst them. At the moment, there's quite a bit of geographic variation of that. There is Western Cape kind of ranges between about 5 to 10%, depending on which points you're looking at. They've kind of looked at trends over time, and they feel it's been increasing, gradually, but in a sustained way. And talking to the head of the South African lab, he said it's the big on the night to worry about this stuff. There was another report from South Korea. I think they tied up set figures of 3.3% bedaquiline resistance amongst their NTB patients. I think bedaquiline probably been around not quite as long there, but anyway, that's sort of an equivalent figure from their setting. Although they did seem to feel that delaminate resistance was more common than bedaquiline resistance in South Korea, and they're reporting sort of current baseline rates of about 7%. I don't think we know anything at all really about resistance. Probably because we didn't have a critical concentration, so I don't think we knew how to test zero. But I think that's going to be very important to know that as well. to which there is positive resistance, and I think we still don't really know. So that was it. That was just.
Thank you. Questions? What I might do in the interests of time is get James, because we here will get to do some networking, so we will get some drink and chat ourselves. And shall we get our next speaker past Ilaria on James?
So I don't think I've met everyone here. I'm James, I'm an academic fellow.
James, you're talking in this lab.
Oh yeah. Okay, tell me if you can't hear me. I'm an academic fellow in infectious diseases. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, or 3 talks about MTB infection, because there was a symposium on that, which was great. And then 4 really short, kind of punchy slides on some biomarkers. So one of them, Camus you mentioned, the new expert assay. So the first is kind of a historical overview and also questions for the future about MTB infection. What do we know, what do we not know, and what should we know, by Tom Scruber. And he nicely summarised the historical data on tests of immunoreactivity. So we know that TST positivity occurs about 40 to 50 days after exposure, and about half of people will convert after exposure. We know that TST and IGRA have poor predicted values of progression to clinical disease, and that risk of progression is highest in the first 2 years. And the big problem is that TST and IGRA can't distinguish between those who are cleared, which is probably the majority, from those with ongoing infection. And he quite nicely stated that these tests essentially are not fit for purpose. So we need a test for TB infection. And there are a few different options that he suggested. One is cell-free DNA that we mentioned previously, and that can use a CRISPR technique. And that another option would be peripheral CD34 positive cells, and they essentially detect cells that have previously been in the bone marrow that are infecting somebody. But that doesn't really tell you if the kind of pathogen is viable. You have cell-free DNA without viable MTB, and likewise for the CD34 cells. So one exciting advancement is these T-cell activation assays, and that is an assay that is most likely to kind of detect recent infection. So if you look at this plot on the left, so the individuals in red are those who have been recently exposed to TB, who have had quantiferon before exposure and then a quantiferon after exposure. And you can see, as expected, they would go from negative to positive. And in black, you can see the individuals who are known to be exposed to individual in the past, who over follow-up remain persistently quantiferon. So that's the issue of quantiferon remain positive. And the same test, they measured levels of HLA-DR positivity, which is a measure of T-cell activation. And you can see in those before exposure, there was no detection. In those who had recent exposure, there was quite high detection, which then reduced over time. And in those who were persistently quantiferon positive, there was low but positive HLA-DR expression. So this is a suggestion that this may be able to detect recent infection, which could be useful for things about treatment, but also for transmission. The next study from the symposium was by Alvaro Schwab from London School, and it was essentially a modelling exercise to establish how much an MTB infection there is worldwide. So the estimates of global prevalence, for the 1/3 to 1/4 of the world population that we often see in the first paragraph of papers, they're derived from immunoreactivity prevalence data. And it has, the modelling there had 3 incorrect assumptions. The first was that immunoreactivity is equivalent to persistent infection. We know that most people self-clear. And as a result, this massively overestimates the annual rate of infection. So they adjusted for this using, wasn't really clear to me exactly the numbers and how they adjusted, but they adjusted using clearance rates previously published. The second incorrect assumption is that infection rates, which are usually established in children, can then be extrapolated to adults. But we know that transmission in adults is actually very different to in children in terms of the number of people they're exposed to, but also the risk of transmission. So they calculated age-specific risk of TB incidence, but also contacts. And the third assumption is that if you are immunoreactive, that persists for life. But actually, some individuals do immunorevert over time, and that underestimates infection. So they adjusted for that by times in the absolute rate of infection the annual rate of infection by 3. So using their updated model, they calculated that, well, they estimated that 2% of the global population has been recently infected within 2 years. And depending on whether they used conservative or optimistic estimates for the rate of self-clearance, they estimated between 5 and 7.7% of the global population are currently infected. They estimate that about 12% of recent infections were in children. And the plot in the bottom left shows the countries and the proportion of infections. They estimated that 87% of those were found in Southeast Asia, the Western Pacific, and African regions. The 3 countries that contributed most to recent infections were India, China, and Indonesia, which represent 50% of the burden. This was one of my favourite talks from the Union, especially for the title, What Can We Learn from the Dead? And this is, so we know that MTB infection is not just the presence of MTB, but it has to be the presence of viable mycobacteria. And that can therefore either reactivate or progress to clinical disease. And there's lots of cool historical studies from the 50s where tissue from autopsy was taken and inoculated into guinea pigs and they developed TB. So we know that there's lots of viable MTB in various tissue, but not all viable MTB is culturable. So MTB exists in a spectrum metabolically and may be non-culturable, yet in the right environment may still be able to progress or reactivate. So this was a study that they performed post-mortems on individuals who died from trauma in Cape Town. And these post-mortems were performed by law because these are individuals who died from non-natural deaths. So car accidents, murder, things like that. So every individual who had a post-mortem was enrolled into the study, and they did low dose full body X-rays. Then the pathologist did full body dissection looking for macroscopic evidence of TB. But they also sampled both intrathoracic, so draining, and also extrathoracic lymph nodes. And with these lymph nodes, they looked with microscopy and also using special stains, and also performed PCR to look for evidence of TB. And in these individuals, in this cohort, they found that 70% had MTB detected in lymph nodes. So if you remove those who had macroscopic evidence of TB, so they dissected the lungs, found a cavity, okay, this individual probably had undiagnosed TB when they were hit by a car. Despite removing those, 64% of individuals had MTB detected in lymph nodes. This wasn't just DNA, they performed staining and microscopy, and they showed some nice images in the presentation, and you could see the pathogen present. What we don't know is whether these MTB are necessarily alive, so they're undergoing proteomics. So I think this is really interesting. Obviously, this doesn't apply. These are individuals in Cape Town who have been hit by a car or been shot, not necessarily reflective of individuals everywhere. But it's interesting to see that at least 60 to 70% of individuals had what looks like viable, although it's not necessarily culturable, MTB present in their lymph nodes. Moving on to the biomarker talks. So this was an interesting study on Trace Expert Ultra performed by Jiwon Sung and Johns Hopkins. So background to this is that Expert Ultra has higher sensitivity than the Expert MTB RIF, and that's because as well as detecting the RPO-B gene, it also has 2 additional targets. And if a trace result is reported as someone who has one of those 2 additional targets detected, but without the RPO-B gene detected. And the problem with this is it is unclear exactly what the implication of a trace filter is, but it also seems to be quite common. So it was 46% in one Ugandan active case-finding study had a trace expert ultra. So in this study, they did community-wide screening of 30,000 individuals, and anyone who had an ultra, they kind of they performed ultra on everyone, and anyone who had a trace was investigated thoroughly for both prevalent and TB. It was quite an impressive study. So this is sorry for the blurry photo, heads nodding. But this shows what investigations the individuals with a trace expert ultra had. So at baseline, they had cultures, they had lamb, they had an X-ray and a CT chest, and they were followed up 2 years with sputum for both expert but also culture, and as well as X-rays. And the headline really is that a half of all of the people they followed up either had prevalent TB. So of the 129 individuals, 43, so 33% of them were diagnosed with TB at baseline. And of the remaining 80 who were followed up, 22, so 28% of those were diagnosed with TB. And they had, the majority of these were diagnosed with microbiological confirmations, that's either culture or a positive expert. And then there were a small number who were clinically diagnosed. And this plot shows that if you had a positive trace, so the plot on the left, compared to those who had a negative expert, you had a hazard ratio of 32 for a microbiological diagnosis of TB. And it was slightly lower when they did a clinical diagnosis of 60. Well, I think this was really interesting. So this is a plot of individuals who had a trace ultra. And on the left, they compare those who had an abnormal X-ray versus a normal X-ray. So if you had a trace ultra and you had an abnormal X-ray, that increased your risk of TB, the hazard ratio of 9.2. However, on the right, when they compare symptomatics, cough versus no cough, there was no difference. So if you have a trace ultra and an abnormal baseline X-ray, you have a much higher risk of TB than if you have a trace ultra and a cough versus no cough. It didn't make a difference. This has already come up, but this is the late breaker on the new expert MDR MDX assay. And essentially, just to summarize very quickly, we have expert RIF and Ultra, which can detect both TB and RIF resistance, and expert XDR, which can't detect TB on its own, but can detect resistance patterns. But what they've done is they have combined essentially the expert Ultra and the MDR assay. So it detects both TB plus RIF, they've combined and isoniazid resistance, and it no longer detects the injectable resistance. And this has a similar level of detection to Ultra. And when they compared it in a sputum biobank study, the caveat that the sputum was frozen for a while, it had similar performance to expert Ultra with good sensitivity and specificity. The RIF resistance had only 94% specificity, but I think they mentioned that of those few individuals who had a false negative, actually they went on to, false positive, they did end up having phenotypic RIF resistance. At the end of the talk, he pointed out that they have no commitment to commercialize this, kept it, but it is still for research purposes. But this is quite promising, and they think it's going to progress. And then my final two talks that I just want to highlight in a similar vein are both on digital stethoscopes. There was a lot of buzz about this. So the first was using digital stethoscopes to classify TB severity by a group in UCSF. And so this is a digital stethoscope, you can see at the bottom right. Essentially what it is it can detect, like your normal stethoscope, audible sounds, but also sub-audible vibrations. And it uses kind of machine learning to quantify the differences. And in this study, they performed a diagnostic accuracy study to classify X-ray severity within the R2D2 network. And X-ray severity was classified as over 50% lung chest X-ray. And this image in the bottom left just shows where this device is put, and the differences, a graphic of the differences between non-extensive disease and extensive. And the stethoscopes had actually pretty good discrimination of severe disease, which was defined as an abnormal chest X-ray. And they suggested that this could be used as a biomarker for stratifying treatment choice regimen. I guess some thought needs to be put into whether or not, if we have a biomarker of severity, which is chest X-ray, when would this be used over a chest X-ray? And also whether or not this is whether it correlates to clinical outcomes of severity. But it seemed to be quite promising. And then a related poster presentation by Helen Cox, UCT, this was a diagnostic accuracy study of digital stethoscopes, so a different digital stethoscope. But this was used for diagnosis of clinically suspected TB against a microbiological reference. And as you can see, of these 240 patients, it had quite good sensitivity, but really rubbish specimens. So really, it cannot be used, as you can imagine, it's essentially a stethoscope. It cannot be used to diagnose those with TB. Importantly, 13% of these individuals had previous TB and 15% were current smokers. So you can imagine that there was a lot of other comorbidities and ongoing lung disease that account for a false positive digital stethoscope. And there was quite a lot of variability between sites, with the caveat that there's quite large confidence. So yeah, that's everything that I was going to present.
Thank you so much. And again, putting your time into presentations. Any questions from our audience online? And I'm just going to ask a general question, and then I think we should crack open the champagne now. We don't have champagne. But when I go to conferences, I always get so energized. I come back, and the data that you've shown all of you is amazing. Is that your feeling, or was there anything that left you feeling anything other than, wow, this is really great to see these innovations? What do you all feel?
My first union.
Okay, so that must have been mind-blowing, wasn't it?
And it was Bali.
They're not all like that.
Yeah, I found it really interesting.
There was some slight trepidation about the use of bedaquiline for everything.
Yeah,
That might be the only negative takeaway. But,
and Ilaria, Nicola?
No, I think I saw a lot of pediatric sessions compared to the other editions. So I was thinking, finally, we are trying to fill the gap in research. So I was happy to see that.
Yeah, Nick.
I didn't have anything that I was disappointed in. I think there's actually more. It's really exciting. I really enjoyed this year. So I think this year was the first year that I went specifically to all the TB sciencing sessions as well.
Yeah.
Really, really good. There was quite a bit of discussion about meningitis. So that was one of the improvements been made in treatment of meningitis. So admittedly, I think a lot of my previous experience with TB meningitis in the pre-ART era. It's interesting to see the improvements in, especially now with the use of bedaquiline, improvements in reductions in mortality rates. So there's lots of exciting and interesting work.
And Suzanne, watching it from afar with the time difference, how was that?
Difficult. But as I said, when one of the talks that I managed to join in with PanTB, I was the discussion that occurred afterwards, discussing the challenges for the trial team. I found really impactful. Actually, it made me reflect a lot on, the trial that I'm doing currently with Di and Co here, and I didn't think about the implications of shutting down early and the effect that would have on everyone. So I found it a useful conference from afar, but actually useful to have access to the on the recorded sessions, so one can go back and review them.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much again to the speakers, to the contributors, to everybody staying online and in the room. The people who had to leave had had other urgent commitments to get to. So it's been amazing. This, as I say, is part of the sort of things we want to do in UCL-TB, but do let us know what you want, and then we'll organise it as best as we can. So have a great evening, and lovely to see you all. Thank you.